Hi, this is Walter GS from GSTwins.com. I'm here with that Vouchers today, and we're going to be going over how to do a simple carb cleaning on the 2001 GS500. Start by removing the seat. With the seat removed, you can access the two 12mm bolts holding the gas tank on. Whoa. With the bolts removed, you can access the petcock by lifting the tank up slightly. I like to use my flashlight to hold the tank up, and it gives you a little light to see what you're doing in there. With the tank lifted up, you can see the fuel tank petcock. You want to use a long flat blade screwdriver to fit into the little groove in the petcock and turn it to either side to turn it off. The service manual directions will tell you to remove the fuel lines here from the petcock. I find it easier to go to the frame-mounted petcock, remove the lines there, and pull the tank out with the lines still on it. Remove the two 5mm Allen head bolts that hold the petcock to the frame. With the petcock removed, you can access the clamps holding on the two fuel lines. I like to use a little bit of paint and mark the reserve line so I make sure I get it back in the right spot. Fuel lines removed, remove the spring clamps, and gently feed the lines up through the frame. Fuel will leak out. Pull back on the tank to free from the frame. Remove the vent hose and gently lift the tank off. Drain the fuel in the float bowl using the float drain here. I like to use a little cap off a carb cleaner to catch the fuel that'll come out. You'll have to do the same process on the other side for the other carb. Remove the two screws holding the airbox in the frame. The screws on this bike have been replaced with 10mm bolts. Loosen the clamps holding the airbox to the carburetors. Gently ply the rubber boots back from the carburetor and wiggle your airbox free. Remove the drain hose from the bottom of the airbox. Remove the vacuum tube coming from the carb to the petcock. And remove the fuel line that still remains on the petcock. Loosen the two clamps on the intake boots that hold the carbs. Make sure you get them plenty loose, but try not to unscrew it all the way out of the clamp. With our clamps loose, you can now wiggle the carbs free of the intake boots. Remove the choke cable from the carbs. Pay attention to how the spring mounts in between the two pieces. Next we'll remove the throttle cables. On 2001 and earlier models there's only one throttle cable. On 01 up you'll have a return cable and the regular throttle cable. Make a little mark so you know which came from where. To remove the throttle cables, use a 10mm wrench and loosen the locking nut at the top. And unscrew it until you can expose the lower nut. Once the lower nut's exposed, unscrew it all the way off the end. So you can free the cable and remove it from the carburetor. Repeat the same process for the other cable. The other throttle cable is a little bit harder to get out of the carburetor. If you can get enough slack in the cable, you can then use an Allen key or a small pick to push it out. These carburetors are in good shape and the bike's running okay, so today we're just doing a basic carb cleaning, not a full rebuild. Now we have the carbs out of the bike, we set them upside down and remove the float bowls. Usually these have screws holding them in, but these have been converted over to Allen head bolts. I like to work on one carburetor at a time just so I don't mix parts up. Start by removing the 4 bolts that hold in the float bowls. If you have screws and they don't want to break loose, use a hand impact driver to break them loose. Don't strip them out. With the screws loose, you can remove the float bowl. The older style GS carburetors will only have 2 screws or 2 bolts holding on the float bowl. Once the float bowl is removed, you can check for deposits and inspect the gasket. This gasket's still soft and pliable, so we can go ahead and reuse it. If yours is hard or brittle, you want to replace it. You can see the float bowl from this carburetor is pretty clean and actually doesn't really need to be cleaned at all. Here's an example of a dirty float bowl off another carburetor. Before you clean all this out, you want to remove this gasket because the carburetor cleaner will damage the gasket. On the new style carburetors, you can access all the jets without removing the float. On the old style carburetors, you have to move the float to access the idle jet, which is down in this hole. So on the old carburetors, you have 1 jet here, and then the main jet here. On the new style carburetors, you'll have 3 jets. 2 small jets here, and then your main jet up top. If you want to remove the jets from the carburetor, pay attention to which jet came from where. I like to take the cap off a carb cleaner can, fill it up with carb clean, and let the jets soak. After your jets have soaked for a while, you want to spray some carburetor cleaner through them. Make sure you wear safety goggles and work with the carb cleaner so you don't get any chemical burns to the eyes, which aren't very pleasant. So just hold the jet up. You'll see a spray of carb clean going right through it. Repeat for all the other jets. The longer jet is kind of hard. If you hold your fingers, you can block the sides. Shoot the carb cleaner through. To check your jets after you clean them, hold it up to the light. You should see a little pinhole through the center of the jet. If your jets are still clogged, guitar string works really well for cleaning out the holes. Since these carbs are so clean already, I'm not going to bother cleaning the passages. If yours look dirty, you can spray some carb cleaner through the passages. Once again, be sure to wear safety goggles so you don't get any in your eyes. Once all your jets are clean, you can go ahead and reinstall them in your carb. Be careful not to over-tighten them. Now, I'm a big fan of the if it's not broke, don't fix it philosophy, so I'm not going to play with the float heights or anything on this carburetor because it was running fine beforehand. With all your jets installed, you can go ahead and put back on your float bowl. Make sure the gasket stays seated properly. Repeat the same process for the other carburetor. Now that the jets are all clean and the float bowls are reinstalled, we're ready to go back onto the bike. So here you can see on my carburetor, the brass caps are all being drilled out so you can reach the idle mixture screws. My bike's running okay, so I'm not going to mess with this adjustment. We'll start by reinstalling our throttle cables. I marked mine when I removed them so I know which screws to wear. If you did not mark yours, you can look which way the throttle twists on the carburetor, and then twist the throttle on your motorcycle. The one that moves out goes on the back side here when the carburetor twists forward. Once you get your throttle cables reinstalled in the carburetor, you need to set the slack in the cable. You want to have a very slight bit of slack so your throttle closes all the way when you release it. So just use your nuts up here to raise or lower it as needed. Once you have the free play and the cable adjusted, lock down your 10 millimeters. Reinstall the choke cable, pull the spring back, insert the cable, and pull the spring forwards, and slide the cable through the holder, leaving the spring in between. Now we're ready to reinstall the carburetors into the engine. Put a little bit of silicone lube so they slide in easier. I find it's the easiest to install the airbox to the carburetors and then slide the whole assembly into the engine. Start by reattaching this drain tube onto the airbox. Then slide the carburetors into the airbox. Once the carburetors are installed in the airbox correctly, tighten down the clamps. Be careful not to pinch your fuel line or your drain tube as you lower the airbox down, and work the carburetors back into the engine. You should feel a little pop when the carburetor is fully seated, and you should look to make sure your intake boots butt up against the housing of the carburetor. A good way to tell if you're fully seated is if the bolt holes on the airbox are lining up. When you're sure the carburetors are properly seated, tighten down the clamps on the intake boots. Reinstall the hose from the breather to the airbox. Reinstall the bolts or screws that hold the airbox in. Reinstall the fuel line that goes from the petcock to the carburetor. Make sure the vacuum line that runs from the carburetor to the petcock is in an area that you'll be able to access it once you put the tank back on. Carefully lower the fuel tank down towards the frame of the bike, making sure your fuel lines aren't getting pinched. Reattach the vent line to the bottom of the tank. Set the fuel tank onto the frame. You're going to have to lift it up again to get turned back on the petcock before you're finished installing it. Drop the fuel lines from the gas tank back through the frame to the petcock, being careful not to pinch them. Reinstall the fuel lines from the tank petcock back to the frame petcock. Be careful not to pinch any of them. The longer nipple on the tank petcock runs to the farther back one on the frame petcock. We made a mark earlier, so we know that we're putting ours back in the right spot. Lastly, you want to reinstall your vacuum line from the carburetor to the petcock. If you forget to install this line, the petcock will not work on the on or reserve settings, only in prime. With all your lines reinstalled, bolt the petcock back onto the frame. With all the fuel lines reconnected, you can go ahead and turn on the petcock on the gas tank. Straight down is on. With the petcock turned on, slide the tank back into position and reinstall the 2 bolts that hold it on the frame. Reinstall the seat. Set your frame petcock to prime to allow fuel to flow into the float holes. It's probably going to take some cranking to get the bike started. After some extended cranking, you'll probably get the bike to start. It may run rough at first, don't worry, this is normal. Once your bike starts, let it run and warm up and make sure everything's okay. Check for fuel leaks or any other abnormal noises. I hope you found this tutorial helpful. For more great information, visit gstwin.com.